Hello everyone, welcome to the course of the Survey of Major English-Speaking Countries. Today, we're going to learn Chapter 10, The History of the United States. This lecture is about Lesson C, the Civil War of this country. The Civil War is the central event in America's historical consciousness. While the Revolution of 1776 to 1783 created the United States, the Civil War of 1861 to 1865 determined what kind of nation it would be. The war resolved two fundamental questions left unresolved by the Revolution: whether the United States was to be a dissolvable confederation of sovereign states, or an indivisible nation with a sovereign national government, and whether this nation, born of a declaration that all men were created with an equal right to liberty, would continue to exist as the largest slave-holding country in the world. Northern victory in the war preserved the United States as one nation and ended the institution of slavery that had divided the country from its beginning. But these achievements came at the cost of 625,000 lives, nearly as many American soldiers as died in all the other wars in which this country had fought combined. After the War of Independence, the United States of America was governed by the Articles of Confederation. These provided for weak central governments and strong state governments. However, it proved unworkable, and a new constitution was adopted that resulted in a stronger federal government, with powers which included regulating interstate commerce as well as foreign affairs. In the mid-19th century, while the United States was experiencing an era of tremendous growth, a fundamental economic difference existed between the country's northern and southern regions. In the north, manufacturing and industry was well established, and agriculture was mostly limited to small-scale farms, while the South's economy was based on a system of large-scale farming that depended on the labors of black slaves to grow certain crops, especially cotton and tobacco. The different states had varying policies concerning slavery. In some areas of the country, where religious groups such as the Quakers played a prominent role in political life, there was strong opposition to having slaves. Rhode Island abolished slavery in 1774 and was soon followed by Vermont, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Connecticut, New York, and New Jersey. The new states of Maine, Michigan, Wisconsin, Ohio, Indiana, Kansas, Oregon, California, and Illinois also did not have slaves. The importation of slaves from other countries was banned in 1808. However, the selling of slaves within the southern states continued. Conflicts grew in the 19th century between the northern and southern states over the issue of slavery. The northern states were going through an industrial revolution and desperately needed more people to work in its factories. Industrialists in the North believed that, if freed, the slaves would leave the South and provide the labor they needed. The North also wanted a tariff on imported foreign goods to protect their new industries. The South was still mainly agricultural and purchased a lot of goods from abroad and was therefore against important tariffs. In 1831, the first anti-slavery society was established in New York. The growth in the anti-slavery activities worried slave owners in the South. They feared that the activities of the abolitionists would make it more difficult to run their plantation system. Well, possible, they wanted to see an expansion of slavery into other areas. They therefore supported the independence of Texas, as they were certain it would become a slave state. They also favored the Mexican War. The Civil War started because of uncompromising differences between the free and the slave states over the power of this national government to prohibit slavery in the territory that had not yet become states. When Abraham Lincoln won election in 1860 as the first Republican president on a platform addressing to keep slavery out of the territories, Lincoln argued, "We have in this nation the elements of domestic slavery. The Republican Party think it wrong. We think it is a moral, a social, and a political wrong. We think it is wrong not confining itself merely to the persons of the states where it exists, but that it is a wrong which, in its tendency, to say the least, affects the existence of the whole nation. Because we think it wrong, we propose a course of policy that shall deal with it as a wrong. We deal with it as with any other wrongs insofar we can prevent it growing any larger, and so deal with it that in the runs of time that may be some promise of an end to it." Lincoln's speech upset Southern slaveholders and poor whites, who valued the higher social status they enjoyed over slaves. However, with rapid European immigrations taking place in the North, they had declining influence over the federal government. In the 3 months that followed the election of Abraham Lincoln, 7 states seceded from the Union: South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. Representatives from these 7 states quickly established a new political organization, the Confederate States of America. The incoming Lincoln administration and most of the Northern people refused to recognize the legitimacy of the Confederation. They feared that it would discredit democracy and create a fatal precedent that would eventually fragment the United States into several small countries. On 8th February, the Confederate States of America adopted a constitution and within 10 days had elected Jefferson Davis as its president and Alexander Stephens as vice president. Montgomery, Alabama, became its capital, and the Stars and Bars was adopted as its flag. Davis was also authorized to raise 100,000 troops. The event that triggered war came at Charleston Bay on April 12, 1861. Claiming this United States fort as their own, the Confederate Army on that day opened fire on the Federal troops and forced it to lower the American flag in surrender. Lincoln called out the military to suppress. By the end of 1861, nearly 1 million armed men confronted each other along a line stretching 1,200 miles from Virginia to Missouri. Lincoln responded by calling for a volunteer army from each state to recapture federal property, which led to declarations of secession by 4 more slave states. Both sides raised armies as the Union seized control of the border states early in the war and established a naval blockade. Land warfare in the East was inconclusive in 1861 to 1862, as the Confederacy beat back Union efforts to capture its capital, Richmond, Virginia, notably during the Peninsula Campaign in September 1862. The Confederate campaign in Maryland ended in defeat at the Battle of Antietam. Days after that battle, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which made ending slavery a war goal. The Emancipation Proclamation enabled African Americans, both free blacks and escaped slaves, to join the Union Army. About 190,000 volunteered, further enhancing the advantage of the Union armies over the Confederates. Huge battles like Shiloh in Tennessee, Second Manassas, and Fredericksburg in Virginia foreshadowed even bigger campaigns and battles in subsequent years, from Gettysburg in Pennsylvania to Vicksburg on the Missouri. By 1864, the original Northern goal of a limited war to restore the Union had given way to a new strategy of total war to destroy the Old South and its basic institution of slavery, and to give the restored Union a new birth of freedom. As President Lincoln put it in his address at Gettysburg to dedicate a cemetery for soldiers killed in the battle, by the spring of 1865, all the principal Confederate armies surrendered. And when Union captured the fleeing Confederate President Jefferson Davis in Georgia on May 10, 1865, resistance collapsed and the war ended. The long, painful process of rebuilding a united nation free of slavery began. The North held many advantages over the South during the Civil War. Its population was several times that of the South. The South lacked the substantial number of factories and industries of the North that produced the needed war material. The North had a better transportation network, mainly highways, canals, and railroads, which could be easily used to resupply military forces in the field. At sea, the Union Navy was more capable and dominant, while the Army was better trained and better supplied. The rest of the world also recognized the United States as a legitimate government, allowing United States diplomats to obtain loans and other trade opportunities. The South had fewer advantages, but among them that the South fought on its home terrain. The South also had a military tradition that encouraged young men to serve in armed forces or attend a military school. Many had served the United States military before the Civil War, only to resign and fight for their states and family. In addition, the South had the leadership of great commanders, including Robert E. Lee, Joseph Johnson, and Stonewall Jackson. Despite the end of the war, conflict still existed. On the night of April 14th, John Booth, a pro-slavery Confederate sympathizer, slipped into the president's box at a Ford's Theater in Washington and fired a single bullet into the back of Abraham Lincoln's head. Lincoln died the next morning, the first American president to be assassinated. The American Civil War was one of the earliest true industrial wars. Railroads, the telegraph, steamships, and mass-produced weapons were employed extensively. The practices of total war, developed by Sherman in Georgia, and of trench warfare around Petersburg, foreshadowed the First World War in Europe. It remains the most destructive war in American history, resulting in the death of 625,000 soldiers and undetermined numbers of civilian casualties. Victory for the North meant the end of the Confederacy and of slavery in the United States, and it strengthens the role of the federal government. The social, political, economic, and racial issues of the war decisively shaped the Reconstruction era that lasted to 1877.